Open Your Eyes is brought to you by the Belize Bank. Our country, your bank.
Good morning. Welcome to Open Your Eyes.
Start your morning right.
I'm Marlene Cuellar.
I'm Asana Caetano.
And thank you for joining us this morning. It is a lovely Monday morning, I have to say that much. We are going to get right into our weather update for today. We have Crystal Rosales on the line. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you today?
I'm great, thank you.
Crystal, it's nice and cool this morning. I'm only hoping it's going to stay like this for the rest of the day. And your answer is?
Excuse me?
And your answer is?
Well, it's going to be relatively cool compared to last week, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, we'll take that. So let's talk about what's happening with our weather.
Well, relatively moist and unstable conditions continue, gradually improving during the next 24 hours.
Okay. And so our 24-hour forecast?
A few cloudy spells with a few showers and isolated thunderstorms developing over the south, and showers will be isolated elsewhere.
Okay. And what about our winds?
Winds will be variable at 5 to 10 knots.
All right. So let's talk about the high temperatures for today. How hot is it going to be?
Today will reach 87 degrees Fahrenheit along the coast, 93 inland, and 80 in the Maya Mountains.
Okay. That is cooler, especially for the inland areas, the lower 90s. What about tonight?
Tonight will be 78 along the coast, 72 inland, and 68 in the hills.
All right. And the extended forecast, what can we expect?
A few cloudy spells with isolated showers or isolated thunderstorms over the south. Then showers, if any, will be isolated elsewhere.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that update, Crystal.
You're welcome.
You have a great day today.
And you as well.
All right.
Bye.
All right, so that's our weather update. We're still expecting some showers and thunderstorms, and especially in the south, I should say. It was a lot cooler this morning than we usually have in the mornings.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's going to warm up throughout the course of the day. So
I was mentioning earlier, Marlene, many of us perhaps went to bed with the fans on last night because it was rather warm.
yeah,
And we woke up this morning having to draw for the
covers,
sheets, right?
yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yesterday afternoon was so hot. You see, the morning it started raining, and then it was just still and humid. And you sat still, and you were still pouring sweat.
Yeah.
So this morning was a great reprieve. We do want you to know that it is going to warm up throughout the course of the day. And you are still expecting showers and thunderstorms, especially in the south. We're going to keep things moving this morning into our eye-opener. And our eye-opener taken from dailyom.com goes like this. Ultimately, you are the one. We spend a lot of our lives looking for role models, mentors, teachers, and gurus to guide us on our path. There's nothing wrong with this, and in fact, finding the right person at the right time can really help. However, it is important to realize that in the absence of such a figure, we can very safely rely upon ourselves. We carry within us everything we need to know to make progress on our paths to self-realization. The outer world serves as a mirror, or to use another metaphor, our inner world has a magnetic force that draws to us what we need to evolve to the next level. All we need to do to see that we already have everything we need is to let go of our belief that we need to seek in order to find. So when we find ourselves on our path, not knowing which way to turn and wishing for guidance, we can turn to ourselves. We may not know the right answer, rationally or intellectually. But if we simply ask, let go, and wait patiently, an answer will come. The more we practice this and trust this process, the less we will look outside ourselves for teachers and guides, for we will have successfully become our own.
This eye-opener for me speaks to an innate quality of leadership, in the sense that, as the first line rightly says, we spend quite a lot of time looking to others for guidance. And when you look at the cycle of life, so to speak, in one's childhood, he or she looks to parents to provide that guidance. Then, perhaps at another point in one's development, he or she looks to their peers. And then, as we move along, that individual ultimately finds himself or herself being a role model to someone else, either to your kids or whomsoever. But when you look within, there is that natural courage and sense of leadership within you, so that when you're lost and you're looking for some direction or what have you, start within. It's there already. All of us, each one of us are born with that. But I think it's the way how we nurture it that allows leadership to blossom, in a manner of speaking, to radiate or to come out from us. And when I look at myself, for instance, I often tell myself I'm self-motivated. So while I look to other persons to see how they go about doing certain things, ultimately, the decision for me to actually excel or do certain things comes from within me. And I always try to show people that. While it's okay to look to others for guidance, you are your ultimate guide. And so it goes back to the first line of the eye-opener. Ultimately, you are the one.
Yeah. You know, I really like this eye-opener. I think, you know, people will interpret it in many different ways in terms of looking for guidance or mentors or role models as to how to perhaps shape their own path. And I think one of the things that the eye-opener is really saying is how important it is to cast away the self-doubt that we tend to have. And we all have it. You know, we question whether or not the choices we make or perhaps the decisions as to what we want to do and how we want to do it are the wrong ones. And we're looking for someone else to validate it in some way, shape, or form, whether it's professionally, personally, or in any other way. And I think that it really is important sometimes that we just develop that level of trust in ourselves. You see, the thing is, it's not just, and it doesn't say that, it's not just that you have that power to make that choice. It's also that you're going to be the one who faces the consequences.
Yeah.
So, you know, the best mentor in the world can give you guidance, but the choices you make, the consequences are yours to bear. And so, you know, in the middle of all the self-doubt that we naturally tend to have, maybe that's a good reminder for us that we do possess the right compass within us to be able to guide us. And, you know, if it's somehow off course, you know, we'll be the ones to face the consequences.
Let me share a general observation here. And I'll only speak for the Mondays on which I appear on the show, right? A lot of the eye-openers that we read and examine and try to find a depth speaks to looking within oneself, because everything in terms of your sense of self or your sense of being emanates from within, right? You are born with a sense of soul and spirituality from which everything comes. And so whenever you find yourself in a place where you're either doubting or second guessing yourself, you're unsure of what direction to take or path you would want to take in life or what have you, it starts from within. You always have to look at yourself. You either do it via introspection or you look at yourself within the context of the big picture, but it always starts from you. And that's one of the observations I've made sitting on this set every Monday morning.
Yeah, and that's why it's our motivation for the day. It's kind of just adding perspective to some of the things I think we need to challenge ourselves.
Yeah.
Whether it's how we maneuver our own selves or how we maneuver ourselves in the wider community. And so we hope that today's eye-opener has been helpful to you and perhaps inspired you to do things just a bit differently this morning. And with that, it is a Monday morning, and there is a lot to catch up on. We're going to be taking a look at the big stories from last week and what we're looking forward to in the week ahead. So let's shift gears to the Eye on the News.
So Marlene, there is a video in circulation that is very much the talk of quite a number of persons on social media, and that video comes now with an official explanation from the police department. Now, to give an understanding of what transpired yesterday, Sunday afternoon, the Belize Police Department received information that an ambulance had left from Dangriga en route to Belize City. However, the circumstances under which that ambulance departed from Dangriga was what led to an incident that occurred in Hattieville at the checkpoint just outside of the roundabout. It is said that when the ambulance left from Dangriga yesterday afternoon, it was not necessarily with a patient, but the fact that the driver of the ambulance was reportedly being held against his will at gunpoint to transport a cargo of weapons and drugs to Belize City. And so, acting on that intelligence, the police department attempted on 2 prior occasions to arrest the vehicle from proceeding towards Belize City. On those 2 previous attempts, they were unable to stop the driver of the ambulance. As a matter of fact, they report that on those 2 occasions, officers were almost ran over in the process of this driver proceeding towards the direction of Belize City. It was not until they got to Hattieville where there was a subsequent checkpoint, and by that time, the information had already been relayed down the pipeline, so to speak, so that when the ambulance arrived in the vicinity of Hattieville near the roundabout, the officers were already armed and prepared to stop the vehicle at all costs. So we're looking at a video here where a team of officers drew down upon this ambulance, and someone from within is recording the episode.
Yeah.
Lo and behold, there was indeed a patient in the ambulance, but the driver of the ambulance wasn't being held against his will. Right? So there was this entire scene that unfolded in Hattieville where guns are drawn, and you can also hear the ambulance driver telling the individual inside the vehicle to record. Right? Now, this
and
has...
also,
Yeah,
the
go ahead.
fleeing daughter saying,
Yeah.
my mother was sick, because that was really
Yeah.
the heart-wrenching part of
Yeah.
that video.
Yeah, precisely, right? This has prompted a response from the police department to put on record exactly what transpired, right? Initially, Commissioner of Police Chester Williams responded to a query that was made by members of the media, our colleague, and then the Media Relations Unit of the police department also issued a formal statement, essentially outlining what I just shared as the course of action that was taken. Nonetheless, they are saying, they're putting forward that had the driver of the ambulance simply explained, perhaps at the first checkpoint, that there was someone who is either critical or someone who is in urgent need of medical attention that he's transporting to Belize, they would not have stopped the progress of the ambulance, right? Because it's not customary that checkpoints require ambulances to pull to the side or what have you. But because of this erroneous information that they were fed, and you have to understand, when the officers receive a tip, their line of duty calls for immediate action to follow up on that particular information, right? And in this case, when they checked with Southern Regional Hospital told them that they had not dispatched an ambulance from the hospital en route to Belize. So now the question is, and I guess perhaps at some point we will get some answers to it, so where did the ambulance come from? If they're saying, if Southern Regional is saying, well, we did not authorize or dispatch.
Depends who they spoke to at Southern Regional.
Well, we would want to think.
Or whether or not the call took place. Here's my thing. I think it was definitely a really traumatic video to be able to see, and I do appreciate that the police department has responded in putting forward their version of events. What we don't have is the story from the people who are inside that.
Or the ambulance, the
we
ambulance
have no
driver or the
verification
families.
as to what is being put forward, and that's always my concern. I mean, I don't think that the police would in any way or I hope they wouldn't maliciously report something, but that doesn't mean that there can't be inaccurate information put forward in between. You know, when someone's being transported to the hospital, it's a matter of minutes that they need to get there. Because it can be a matter of life and death. But yeah, I do think that it is clear. Here's the thing, we don't have hundreds of ambulances in this country that you would not miss one. In fact, I can't remember the exact number of ambulances in the South, but it's easy to count, maybe 1, 2, 3. One or two, I would say. And that's if it hasn't come from another area as well. We don't have that many ambulances. So I do hope that there's some verification as to what took place here and that this wasn't just, you know, an unfortunate situation that could have been avoided.
Well, it could have. Well, they're saying that it could have been avoided if the driver simply informed the officers at the checkpoint what was the situation at hand. That's what the police department is putting forward, right?
So they're saying he raced through checkpoints and nobody followed him along the way. No highway patrol was able to intercept.
No.
From Dangriga.
At least not what they're saying in their report. They're simply saying that they were prepared for him at a subsequent checkpoint near Hattieville. So that's how that played out, right? Again, it's quite a frightening scene when you look at it. So you could only imagine what the individuals inside the vehicle must have felt for them to be surrounded by officers at gunpoint. So I think this warrants a little more digging into, and I'm certain that we're going to provide additional information other than what has been presented to us by the police department insofar as what took place yesterday. So I just wanted to begin with that because I know that the video, you know, is making its rounds. Yeah, certainly. So the other thing that I wanted to touch on, and this has been a recurrent theme of our Eye on the News simply because we're living in COVID times, right? Going into the weekend, we were at the very end of the 28-day window of gestation for the coronavirus since the last patient was tested positive. And so we're yet to receive official word from the Ministry of Health as to where we are, that we've successfully crossed that threshold, or if there's any new developments that we ought to be aware of. In that context, the National Oversight Committee is also scheduled to meet today, and out of that meeting will be perhaps several recommendations, because in the Prime Minister's press conference on Friday, he alluded to the fact that there can be expected some further relaxation in terms of the regulations that fall within the state of emergency. However, this is subsequent to the cabinet meeting tomorrow to approve what other measures will be put into effect or will be relaxed, right? So the National Oversight Committee meets today. That precedes tomorrow's cabinet meeting, at which it will be made official as to what happens next. Again, it's contingent on the Ministry of Health reporting to us whether or not we successfully crossed that 28-day
And we didn't get a
threshold.
report yesterday.
Yeah.
So this last infographic that we have is from Saturday, and it shows that we were still with all negative cases at this point, and the positive tests are now recovered, with the exception of the 2 who died as a result of COVID-19. And only 1 case was under investigation as of Saturday. So I'm not sure if they proceeded with additional testing on Sunday. We didn't get any report, as I said. But 28 days of no positive confirmation, and we'll see what the National Oversight Committee decides upon today. I think the Prime Minister gave us a little bit of insight in looking at, he said, looking at loosening the restrictions for cross-district travel,
Domestic
allowing
tourism.
for swimming in pools and rivers and seas. So we'll see what they decide.
From an economic standpoint, and I'm not really one for crunching numbers and that sort of stuff, right? Don't have that bone in me. But I look at it from this perspective, just based on numbers that pop up. The first reported case of COVID-19 in Belize was in late March.
March 23rd.
Yeah. Since then, we had 18 confirmed cases, 2 casualties. A number of persons were investigated. We're at over 1,000 tests being administered to determine whether or not, persons are COVID positive. But the number that sticks out the most, which came from the Prime Minister's press conference on Friday, is that we are $450 million in the hole, right? So that's the figure which shows the economic impact, right? We're looking at 18 confirmed cases, 2 persons unfortunately lost their lives, but the economy is in the red, $450 million. And so this is the picture that we're looking at going forward. Regardless of what measures are removed or added or what have you, in terms of dollars and cents, our economy has taken a serious hit, right? And so as we prepare to open up back and try to get back on firm footing, we're looking at the fact that it seems to get progressively worse, because while the figures for late March, April, it gets worse in May in terms of persons being cut from their salaries, job losses altogether, and that sort of stuff, right? So there is a sense of optimism that eventually we'll get over, but it kind of gets worse before it gets better. And it's just the fact of the matter as it stands.
Well, I think if you watch, because this conversation is happening internationally, I think economists globally kind of agree that the recovery from COVID-19 is not going to be short-term, that it's going to be long-term.
Yeah.
And I think that is extremely worrisome for us in Belize, because not only do we need to get things moving here, but we rely on the incomes or the economic status of people, especially in North America, to be able to travel again, which is an important part of our economy as well. And we had always said, I think, in many conversations, that this was a dual crisis. It was, well, I should say it was even more than 2. There were several issues kind of just building up as we first entered into this pandemic, into this phase of this pandemic, and the health crisis was definitely paramount. And I think no one can fault the government in being able to prioritize the health crisis first. But we knew that economic crisis was also happening at the same time, even before we had our first confirmed case. And then we have to look at the social fallout as well, and many other issues. And now it seems that this is the time that we're kind of putting the focus on the economic crisis. And you know what I hope and we would hear very soon is some sort of plan of action. Some sort of, it's going to take innovation. We don't know when we'll be able to open the borders. They're saying maybe July. We don't know what's going to happen. Everything has changed so much on a weekly basis. We don't know what July looks like as yet. and we're so dependent on North America, or specifically the US, getting a handle on their COVID situation, and labs being able to mass produce rapid tests that we have access to that have some form of accuracy. So those are all things that we have to depend on. But locally, we got to get our innovation hats on and start figuring out what we can do to kind of get the wheels turning here again.
Yeah.
There seems to be a lot of hope from the Prime Minister's presentation. He's hoping that domestic tourism will help. I think I've had this conversation with quite a few people. It's a matter of how feasible it is for people who are a part of the tourism industry to be able to cater to the numbers of Belizeans who can still afford to travel. And we've always talked of how the prices for traveling within Belize are sometimes just out of budget for your average Belizeans, and that budget has shrunk for all of us. You know, if you're not facing job losses, you're facing slashed salaries. So, you know, the budget is even smaller. So what will hotel owners have to do to get Belizeans to travel there? Don't get me wrong, there's some who can still afford it. They could have afforded it before this crisis, they can still afford it now. They'll enjoy the luxury of travel, but it's not going to be the same across the board. So, you know, I'm assuming that that's perhaps the phase that they have entered into, or they are going to enter into. We know we have Dr. Barnett and Chris Coy, who were named the czars. They were the economic advisors to kind of get us through the unemployment phase. But I think clearly there has to be an expanded role in looking at what we can do to kind of get just the economy moving again. And it's not just big businesses and industries. A lot of small businesses that are struggling.
It's everyone.
I mean, consider your daily habits in February. You know, whether you bought breakfast, lunch, dinner, how many people you had provided to in just one single day, whether those people are working, whether you can afford to pay for 3 meals a day every single day. All of these things have changed, and they have a very big impact in the bigger picture. So, yeah, I'm hoping to hear some innovative solutions soon, because we're hearing very clearly that we are in economic stress, and that's an understatement. But what I'm not hearing are the ideas as to what we're going to do. And hopefully it won't be the same old.
Another point that I want to touch on as well that is equally important is the situation between the government of Belize and the Public Service Union. Right? I know that on Friday, the Prime Minister was rather stern in his position in respect of the increments that are due to public officers, and the fact that the union is considering deferral of the payment of those increments as opposed to a waiver, which altogether writes off whatever they would have received this year. Because other government workers, including ministers and chief executive officers, contract workers, are already taking certain cuts that are considered, in the Prime Minister's word, weightier than what the Public Service Union and the teachers would be sacrificing. And so the unions work in such a manner that they usually confer amongst themselves before taking a collective position and putting that out there. So that I know that all of this was still relatively new in terms of the PM's response on Friday, which would give them some time now to be able to call a meeting and discuss what the next move is going forward. What we can reiterate is that the Prime Minister expressly stated on Friday that there were 2 options that he could have considered. He can, 1, go to the Governor General and advise that the public service regulations are amended to affect the salaries of public officers, or it can be done by matter of imposition, which does not require a statutory instrument to be amended. He can simply just impose that on them. And like I said, it merits following up to see what the position is of the PSU in light of this new development. So that is also something that we'll be looking into.
It's a tough situation. It's a tough conversation to be having at this time, because I think the immediate needs, as is being requested by the government are very easy for people to understand.
Yeah.
While the union's position, and we can say, because we've been covering it for such a long time, has been a long-standing issue. You know,
Yeah.
I think one of the clear misinterpretations that I've heard in terms of how the issue is being portrayed is that it's just about the increments in salaries. And I've seen in other media interviews from last week where the PSU has been very clear to say that they're not saying they're not willing to take a pay cut, they're just asking for a deferral. And I think there was a very clear explanation in terms of looking at the implications of not receiving an increment in 1 year and what it means long term when you add it up for your years of service.
Yeah.
So a cut of $900 for this year alone equates to $9,000 lost when you finish your years of service, versus a minister giving up $4,000. And you know, the plain argument I think that people have is just very simple. You make $5,000 a month and you lose $1,000. It's a loss, but it's not the same as me who makes $2,000 and I lose $1,000. And I think that is it's the matter of if you put it on a balance scale, how does it work out? But beyond that, and I don't want to simply focus on the issue of the salaries, the PSU, when they first put out their request, it went far beyond looking at deferral. It was looking at what is the government doing to cut costs internally.
Yeah.
In other words, before you go to the salaries, let's look at what else you're
What other
doing
areas?
as cost-saving measures. And it was really practical things, in my opinion, and you know that means very little to people. But you talk about whether or not government cars are being used, vehicles are being used, just how much you're saving just in your expenditures day by day, to just show in good faith that you are really pinching and cutting down as much as you can before you start making people feel the impact. I mean, not your public officers, and it depends on where they are. They don't make the grand salaries that I think we or people may think they do, and they live
There's a breakdown.
Paycheck to paycheck like all the rest of us.
There's a breakdown that the PM used in terms of first-class clerks and going down, right? One of the interesting things here, Marlene, and it's an obvious one, is that this scenario would have involved or does involve a tripartite body made up of the Belize National Teachers Union, the PSU, and the Association of Senior Public Service Managers, right? APSSM. But BNTU and APSSM are, conspicuously quiet on the matter, right? Leaving the PSU to sort of battle this one out on its own.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at the idea of silence means consent, the fact that these two other bodies have not come forward to say, you know what, we are in support of or we don't agree with, they've not openly voiced a position on the matter. And so it gives the PM sort of that position that they are okay with making the sacrifice as well, and that it's only the PSU that, in his words, remains intransigent, right? So, like I said...
Well, I wonder, though, because I know we have interviewed Senator Lena Smith, the head of the president of the BNTU here, and we did speak about the issue. And she did share similar concerns. It was before there was this ultimatum put that they would change the regulations if needs be. She'd spoken about having consulted with some of the teachers saying that they weren't, some teachers had responded that they weren't comfortable. And she spoke, which is why I know of the cost-saving measures. She outlined the very same cost-saving measures that seem to have fallen out of the conversation at this point in time. And I also want to, just on a human level, I think when people hear things like housing and entertainment allowance being cut by half, it's tough. It's tough. $800, which means you still collect $800 for your housing and entertainment allowance. I mean, we're looking at 80,000 people who have applied. We can't verify their actual unemployment, but 80,000 people saying that they have no income. And then you're saying, well, we're going to give up $800, but keep $800 for whatever entertainment or rent or whatever it is. It's a tough pill to swallow. And I grudge the situation that they're in. But let's be honest about how Belizeans feel, and that's a part of it.
Yeah, certainly. I mean,
Wouldn't you appreciate a $800 entertainment allowance?
who wouldn't?
Exactly.
But at the same time, too, though, I mean, if you were to, I don't know, add all of that up against the 80,000 applicants, perhaps against those who did not qualify, then you have a picture going there as well, right? It's tough times, Marlene. It's difficult and challenging times for all of us.
I agree. And I think what's being asked is very simple. Or what it seems to be, just make sure that we're all taking the pinch together.
All right, so that concludes our Eye on the News this morning. These stories and more can be viewed at 6 o'clock in our evening newscast.
All right, and that means it's time for us to get moving into our show for today. And we're starting off with a COVID-19 update. This time we're taking a look at the national response. We'll have Senior Counsel Andrew Marshallek weighing in on that this morning.
That's a two-part conversation, right? And so that the other segment of our show is to speak with the Student Union of Belize and how they feel and how they view the youth and COVID perspective.
All right, and we're closing off with another edition of Kids Time. And Dr. Binox is going to be teaching us about famous inventions. So that's going to be how we close off the show for today. We're going to go ahead and take a break. And when we come back, we'll get our conversation started. So please stay tuned.
In these challenging times, the one
History, a health and wellness message from your Ministry of Health.
And welcome back. We're about to get into the first segment of our show this morning. And as promised before the commercial break, we have with us via Zoom interview Senior Counsel Andrew Marshall-Leck, and we will be discussing the national response to COVID-19. This, of course, will be taken from multiple perspectives, Marlene, to look at holistically what government and what its other agencies have been doing to deal with the issue. Good morning, Senior Counsel Marshall-Leck.
Morning, Isani. Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome, sir. Now, let's begin. I think one of the first features when we look at the response to COVID-19 was the establishment, if I may, of a National Oversight Committee, which was a bipartisan effort that included other players, so to speak, as well. Let's begin with your thoughts on the fact that the government was able to reach out to the opposition and other partners to form such a body to be able to tackle the issue of COVID-19 from an economic standpoint as well as from a public health standpoint.
Well, the starting point there, Isani, is to recognize that those bodies are completely without legal authority or standing. They're ad hoc, and they're the brainchild of the Prime Minister. They have no constitutional standing. And this has led me to my main observation, which is really that our constitutional democracy has been hijacked and replaced by an authoritarian regime headed by those very bodies for the purposes of management of COVID. And while that might sound alarming, when you look at it definitionally, all it really means is that the bodies are authoritarian, or the regime is authoritarian, because there's been a complete submission to authority, to the exercise of authority, as distinct to reliance on any individual freedom of thought or action during the period of the emergency. It's also an authoritarian form of government in that you have a small group of elites without constitutional standing exercising powers of government, and they're not accountable to the people. So that all the usual checks and balances and safeguards that would govern the normal exercise of power by public institutions do not apply to these bodies.
Okay, that's a mouthful there. That's a lot for us to begin to digest, Andrew. Let's go back a bit. When you're saying that they're not constitutionally recognized, in a manner of speaking, what ought to have been the process in order for them to fall within the ambit of the Constitution?
Well, normally what you would have seen is some sort of law passed that constituted the task force as a body and conferred powers on them and delimited the exercise of those powers and subjected to some form of public accountability or transparency in its deliberations. There's none of that. It's operating in a legal vacuum. It operates under the authority that's being exercised rarely by the Prime Minister. But the Prime Minister is not obliged to listen to these committees. He can disband them at will. In and of themselves, they have no standing.
Is it to say then that anyone who has made the same observation that you have from a legal perspective could have challenged the authority and the composition of the National Oversight Committee?
Well, that's a problem. There is no law that governs the committee, its composition, or its establishment. What you're left with is challenging the actions, the decisions of the committee as implemented by the authorities. And those actions would have to be against the state. The institutions of the state have adopted voluntarily the decisions of these bodies. It is interesting that even Parliament is supposedly being subjected to the decisions of these bodies and are being used to rubber stamp these decisions. So that even in the one instance when there was a limited debate as to the continuation of the state of emergency, one of the major criticisms that faced the leader of the opposition was that, from the Prime Minister, was that he was voting contrary to what he did on these bodies, supposedly. And using moral suasion to subject Parliament to the decisions of this hand-picked ad hoc group.
Doesn't it appear then that, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that perhaps the National Oversight Committee now supersedes the Cabinet and perhaps the House of Representatives?
Well, not legally, but as a matter of fact, on the ground, yes, it does. Those democratic institutions, Cabinet, Parliament, are being used to rubber stamp decisions taken by these bodies, and those decisions are not subject to any transparency or any public accountability or any lawful parameters.
Okay, now let's go ahead, Marlene.
No, I was going to backtrack just a bit because you said very clearly that the legal concern is what authority would something like a National Oversight Committee have, because it's not written within our laws. Could it not just be seen as an advisory body that allows for being able to guide the decisions being made by government?
Yes, it can. And in that case, they would be giving the Prime Minister and Cabinet advice, and then Cabinet would be acting.
Yes.
But I don't think that's what we're seeing happening. We're seeing the Prime Minister and Cabinet actually waiting for decisions to be taken and then simply passing the decisions forward. I think you have to look at the circumstances that gave rise to these bodies.
Yes.
Immediately prior to COVID, we had a number of scandals affecting Cabinet. We had a number of court decisions, all of which served to undermine confidence in the ability of Cabinet to continue to govern. And what they've done in order to regain some confidence during the period of the emergency is effectively to reconstitute and delegate its authority. But now we see a complete submission to that body and an attempt to cloak all the decisions being taken and all the regulations coming down and all the hardships and consequences of them, to hide behind this body. So it's the National Oversight Committee and the National Task Force that's doing these things. And they're somehow to accept responsibility for it, except they don't really legally exist. It is really Cabinet and the Prime Minister doing these things. But under supposedly the advice of these bodies.
Now, we're living in exceptional times, and we can't not bring that into the conversation. When the first statutory instrument was passed, and there have been maybe 10, 20 between March and now, it was a state of emergency exclusively for San Pedro. And from there, we saw the extension, the expansion, and then finally, it was taken to the House of Representatives. What about these statutory instruments being able to effectively allow for the decisions that have been made so far under the state of emergency?
Yes. I want to correct one thing you said there, Marlene, in that none of these regulations in the statutory instruments have in fact been put before the House. What was put before the House was whether or not the period of the state of emergency ought to be extended. But but none of the regulations themselves that supposedly emanate from the task force has been subjected to any real public scrutiny and analysis as to their efficacy. Where we are, the starting point for that is that the Constitution, Section 18, allows for the Governor General to proclaim a state of emergency.
Yes.
And he must certify that certain circumstances exist in order for that to be done. And one of them, if you read it, it says, and you need to get the language correct, it says a state of war is imminent. Notice the use of the word imminent means it's threatened. It hasn't yet happened, but it's threatened. And the other one is that a public emergency has arisen as a result of the outbreak of infectious disease. Now, I've always questioned whether or not there has been an outbreak of infectious disease in Belize. It seems to me that an outbreak was certainly threatened. It's kind of akin, Marlene, to a hurricane threatening and a hurricane arriving. Hurricane Mitch, for instance, threatened us for days. In the end, it turned away from us and never did really come. I think that we had an outbreak of infectious disease threat. And even if the one positive result was or is enough in according to certain definitions to constitute an outbreak, I think the end of the first wave effectively put an end to that and offers us a reprieve to gather ourselves and to calmly and rationally assess our risk and decide the way forward. I don't think that there was any basis for extending the emergency. I think we're moving away from emergency action now and should probably move away from it. And I think all the easing and relaxation of the regulations reflect the fact that there is no real, there is no outbreak pending.
You know, I think one of the perspective, as you shared it, is definitely a legal one in how you interpret what the state of emergency would be used for. However, I think from a health perspective, the argument would be that the restrictions that were put in place did allow for the minimized spread of the virus, and also for us to not see the level of outbreak that we had feared.
Yes, I think that would be the argument for many years to come. And I don't question the wisdom of the medical doctors. I'm not a doctor. What I question is the use of emergency regulations or emergency powers to put in force those measures. You see, we didn't need to put in force all the social distancing and limitations on freedom of movement and all of it in the exercise of emergency powers. Those things could have been achieved by way of exercise of powers under the Quarantine Act and by way of exercise of powers under the existing Public Health Act. You see, when you do it that way, you do it fully recognizing and giving effect to all constitutional rights and all constitutional safeguards, instead of declaring an emergency and stepping outside of that framework in order to do what you need to do.
Are you challenging then?
I think it's time for us to squarely get back within the framework, because COVID isn't going anywhere, and we can manage the country indefinitely into the future through successive emergencies. Are
you challenging then that perhaps our constitutional rights are being impinged on based on these quote-unquote ad hoc decisions?
They may or may not. The regulations, when you exercise emergency powers, the regulations can supersede and take away constitutional rights, but only to the extent that they're reasonably justifiable in the face of the threat. I think there will be debate for years to come as to whether or not a lot of these measures were reasonably justifiable in the face of the threat. I noticed that across the Caribbean region and many countries in the world have opted to exercise emergency powers and have passed regulations. The devil lies really in the inconsistencies and the variety of forms these regulations have taken and the results in fact achieved. Even across the Caribbean, you see Barbados, St. Kitts, for instance, have 24-hour state of emergencies, what's to say that you need a 24-hour state of emergency as opposed to a 12-hour state of emergency, like Belize adopted? And Belize had a lower infections than some of them. So the question arises, and I only use that as an example because there are many aspects of the regulations that you're really left wondering, does it go too far or has it gone far enough? Has there been an overreach here in many instances? And to the extent that there have been overreaches, it is certainly justiciable.
Let me just get a bit of clarification here, because now you introduce something that, you know, so much has changed so quickly we perhaps forget what has happened. But when the first state of emergency was put into place, there was a very quick adjustment that was made. The state of emergency was made under the quarantine authority.
No. It was separate. The proclamation of the state of emergency was distinct from the quarantine order. There were two SIs passed.
Yeah.
Not one.
Yeah. And so, because first it was only for San Pedro, then it moved for the entire
Correct.
country.
Correct.
You just mentioned that you thought perhaps using the Quarantine Act would have been enough for us to be able to do everything that we have been doing without the impact on our constitutional rights. What makes you make that argument?
Well, let me correct that a little.
Okay.
When you read the Quarantine Act, the quarantine authority is conferred certain powers under the statute. It basically allows them to control the borders and close off borders in order to prevent the spread of disease. The quarantine order was in fact went well beyond that and sought to regulate business activity, associations, freedoms within the borders itself. So I think the quarantine orders that were made were really an overreach, and it was in excess of what was really permissible. And I think to some extent it is a recognition of that excess that led to reliance on emergency powers. Now, in addition to the Quarantine Act, there's also a very old Public Health Act, which would have allowed those kinds of restrictions to be made. So it could have been done the same things could have been achieved by exercising a combination of powers under both acts. Or a new act could simply have been passed to provide for these, everything it needed when time permitted. And I think time does permit for that to be done now.
In your legal opinion,
yes.
In your legal opinion, Andrew, because we're looking at perhaps the first SI being signed that brought into effect the state of emergency. And thereafter, we've seen a number of amendments being made as we go along to add and take away, as it were, because indeed the situation is fluid. From a legal perspective, do you believe that perhaps there could have been one statutory instrument that encompasses everything else that would have fallen under it as we proceed?
Of course, what there could have been was an arrangement akin to what we have for hurricane disaster management. We can have a piece of legislation that establishes, for instance, and I only put a name to it, infection alerts. And you can have any number of them, say you have 4 of them, an alert level 1, alert level 2, alert level 3, alert level 4, and with each can come a predefined and set of restrictions and policy measures to address the infection. That is by far the better approach, because this constant revision of regulation has really increased the disruption to the local economy, in that you're never completely sure what regulations apply or will be applied or how. And there's no way to plan to minimize the effect of the disruption, because there will be disruption in any event. But providing for it in a certain way allows all of us, individuals, businesses, to plan our affairs so that insofar as it's possible, things can function even within the context of fighting a threat such as COVID. That wasn't done. And the fluid nature of it, I think, and the multiple changes to it, really is not to be commended as agility in the face of a moving target, but really uncertainty and a lack of planning in how to treat with it.
You know, it can always be argued that the clarity that comes with hindsight is what you wish you have at the start of this journey. And no country was prepared adequately to be able to address the pandemic as to how...
Well, that's not true. I see New Zealand, for instance, invoked their 2006 Pandemic Response Act. I don't remember the exact name of it.
Yeah.
And they have levels of lockdown, just like I described. The world has fully anticipated the possibility of pandemic for very many years. And a lot of countries have in fact planned for it, Marlene.
Yes, and they have faced some of the terrible outbreaks in the past. They have faced SARS and MERS and Ebola. And so somehow when you get that first exposure, you realize that you have to plan for it. It's like how we never used to have a tsunami warning until we had the first threat of a tsunami. So this is kind of our first test for pandemics. My point is though, just let me get to my question. The point is that there's a lot that can be understood now about how we can move forward legislatively. Is your point that we should take this time now, where we have no active cases, where we are, as the Ministry of Health seems to be alluding, between the waves, to get the process more defined? I like what you're saying with hurricane warnings. We know what one flag means, we know what two dots mean, we know exactly what to expect. And the unpredictability over the past month and a half has definitely led to a lot of confusion and frustration. Is that what you're saying? Use this time now.
Yes. And my concern is, Marlene, that a lot of what has happened can really be explained by reference to crowd science. For instance, you have a gunshot going off in the public, everybody starts running. People run in every direction. People run because they see other people running. Some run even towards the danger. Learning the science for dealing with that situation is to take a moment of calm, look around you, assess your risk, and then decide how to move forward. Well, the pandemic was the gunshot, and everybody's instinct was to lock up and to keep it away from me, from yourself. I'm not sure the extent to which the exact measures were rationalized or are actually underpinned by science, which has been considered for our unique circumstances, and how much of it was just following what everybody else was doing. I think you can use this moment of the break between waves, and there'll be a second wave and a third and a fourth and a fifth and a sixth, and however many you want to count into the future until a vaccine is found. But to use this moment of calm to assess Belize's risk and to appropriately provide for it. This successive emergency management and the ad hoc and, to me, almost arbitrary imposition of rules will not work. In fact, the price for those measures and the price of that uncertainty in terms of the economic consequences of them
are
still to be paid. That price has not yet been fixed, and it will be substantial.
Let's segue into that for a second there, because if you're describing the response as ad hoc, then it has perhaps a direct effect on the economic state of affairs of the country, because you're saying that perhaps those decisions are questionable, and therefore when you look at how it affects our day-to-day ability to conduct business and trade and commerce and what have you, it's directly pegged. Do you believe then that all of this, what we're seeing in terms of the economic situation present, is attributable to some of those decisions that were taken, either in the draconian nature of the decisions, or the fact that perhaps they weren't well thought out before being implemented?
Well, it it's a combination of things, and it may be all of that plus more. I mean, some of it results from the nature of the pandemic itself and the epidemic of fear and the pandemic of fear that resulted from the threat of the disease, because I think we're dealing with two pandemics. We're dealing with a pandemic of the coronavirus, and we're dealing with a pandemic of fear. And it's hard to distill what really was just rooted in fear and what was rooted in medical science and necessary to address the disease. But even if you take it, say that, and assume for a moment that all of it was required by the medicine, I think it's misplaced to make decisions solely on the basis of medical considerations. I want to draw a distinction here, and it might seem pedantic, but I think what is important and what should have been paramount was the well-being of our people. And yes, the well-being includes good health, but it also has another dimension that's equally important, and that is the access of resources, access to resources to sustain life, because one is no good without the other. And if we make decisions solely with a view to maintain a zero infection rate, but the economic consequences of those decisions going into the future are far graver than the risk presented by infection, then we will see that the benefit of grounding decisions in those medical considerations would have been outweighed by the detrimental consequences to well-being, in that they would have compromised our ability to access resources to sustain life.
Let me ask you a quick question before we go into our break then. Earlier, I looked at very small numbers to try to paint a picture. I was saying initially that we had 18 confirmed cases. 2 persons died. The entire country went into a lockdown, borders were shut off, everything. And now we're in the red for almost $450 million, right? Based on everything that came.
That's not the end of it.
It's not the end of it. It's where we are at present.
The thing with economic consequences is that there's normally a lag in them fully being visited upon us. We will be enduring the consequences of those lockdown measures well into next year. We have not seen the extent of the consequences. The loss of employment was the initial consequence, but it's by no means the only one. When tourism effectively suffered the blow it did, we not only lost jobs, we lost 40% of our earning capacity for foreign exchange. That will have a far greater impact in the long run. That requires, in order to address it, a fundamental shift in the way we choose to live our lives. We will need to adjust our use of foreign exchange in the face of the unavailability of it. And if we do not do that, we will suffer the consequences of successive balance payments imbalances. We will deplete our reserves and we'll be forced to borrow from anybody who will lend. And whenever we can no longer find anybody to lend, we will suffer the consequence of that.
That's fair enough. All right, so what we'll do at this point, Andrew will take a quick commercial break, and when we return, we'll go into the second part of our conversation on the national response to COVID-19.
Technology.
Today's COVID update is brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price but stay for the service.
And we're back, and we are continuing our conversation, taking a look at the national response to COVID-19 in Belize. And we are joined by Senior Counsel Andrew Marchallek, sharing concerns and suggestions as to what needs to be done in terms of the legislative changes that we have seen and will need to see moving forward. Andrew, before we went to the break, you were very clear about the current situation being one where it's the best time to plan. We know we may be facing other outbreaks or waves in the near future. And so it seems paramount that we kind of get things in order as to how we'll progress and allow for a level of predictability for the wider community. What is your main suggestion? We've heard the opposition before speak of putting forward a COVID-19 Act. Is that what you are suggesting as well?
Well, we need legislation. What you choose to call it, is neither here nor there. It can be done by a complete revision of the Public Health Act. It can be done the nomenclature, the names aren't really important. What we need to do is to establish a legal regime for the management of this risk going forward. The risk is not going to go away. It might be minimized by discovery of a vaccine or discovery of treatments, but it's not going anywhere. And we need a regime that can stay in place permanently, that all of us can plan to meet and plan to function in whatever way we can in our daily lives and in the conduct of our business, so as not to cause the kind of disruption that we've seen over the last month in Belize.
And one of the things you mentioned,
I think, is readily achievable.
One of the things you mentioned was looking at what other countries have been able to do successfully. Is there anything that you have found or noted that we can perhaps use as a model, a starting point for us, and especially given our Belizean reality?
Yes, a lot of countries have put a lot of thought and study into it, and there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. I personally like the notion of different alert levels and a lockdown being imposed gradually and predictably, so that if you have, like the hurricanes, the first flag, it might go to the second flag and the third, and you know what each means. I like that approach. And the medical advice can be taken into account with each of them. I think the first alert should be a warning that, look, this disease is out there, it might come. The second one might be more, please adopt these voluntary measures. The third might be a combination of voluntary and mandatory, and the fourth might be a complete lockdown. And when we move from 1 to 2, we know what's coming. And it's time to make sure your IT is in order, because you may need to work from home, and to make certain arrangements for things to continue in that environment. That is the kind of thing we need. What we don't need are regulations to be changed every week. It throws everybody into a complete loop.
Yeah.
Marlene, I can understand.
Let's not gloss over that point, because I think some of it was avoidable, and we've kind of had that discussion right here on this show. The level of uncertainty clearly came from the response that we created as the situation unfolded. But there seemed to have been just great miscommunication, and I guess it goes back to your original point with the National Oversight Committee as to who's making decisions, what they're guided by, whether it's by scientific purposes, whether it's by the interest for the individual sectors that are involved, or whatever other reason. We've seen where the Attorney General and Minister of National Security has put forward information that is then interpreted differently by the Commissioner of Police, and then we see a change the following day that takes place. We saw very early on questions in terms of what businesses were allowed to function and which ones weren't. I think that's still something up to today when you think of the small businesses that are still not able to carry out their service is still one of the questions that we have. So you know, do you think that there was a way for us to be able to have prevented that level of uncertainty, all the mixed messaging and confusion that happened?
Sure, and don't forget, I want to add to your list the fight between the minister and the commissioner at the Food Distribution Center for the Salvation Army.
Yes.
And then I want to add to that the mini coup in San Pedro.
San Pedro.
Because San Pedro ignored the constitutional regulations altogether and imposed their own. And that is, of course, ripe for suit for anybody who suffered loss. It was entirely unlawful. So what you had were reflections of authoritarianism, which is just an exercise of authority. The executive passes law, interprets it, and enforces it. And there's no oversight of it in any meaningful way. And those are the kinds of confusions that result when you pursue that kind of government.
Do you believe that the panic that was created and the fear of the so-called unknown relating to COVID-19 made us all submissive in a way that we never stepped back to understand fully what the implications of some of these decisions were, and we just sort of followed along because it's from some sort of an authority?
Yes, and that's why I referred back to crowd science. What it was that there was a gunshot in the crowd, and everybody ran, and we ran because we saw others running. And it's the same thing. What there was pervasive fear, and as a result of all the fear, we started following, looking for somebody to lead us to refuge, to safety, to protect us from the threat of death. Although even the leaders didn't quite know what to do, other than trying to lock us away from it.
Let me ask you a question in terms of enforceability, because, you know, a part of very early on, when there was the first state of emergency, that I'd asked the commissioner was, there's a lot of discretionary power that is given to the police department at this time. And we have seen where, you know, today, as I've said before, the interpretation is one thing, the next day the interpretation is another. And so we as citizens, if we move around, it's up to the individual officer that we interact with who makes a choice as to whether or not we are legitimately allowed to move, or many other circumstances so far. How much of the charges that have come out from this are enforceable, especially given the misinformation that we've seen publicly take place?
I would think that now that the courts are beginning to open back up, you will see some of those challenges and some of those interpretations and enforcements tested. Well, I would hope so that at least they don't repeat in future, that kind of government doesn't repeat in future. I think a lot of it is challengeable. I think certainly in San Pedro, I don't see how anybody would have been charged for breach of those curfew hours that had no lawful basis at all. I think even in Belize City and elsewhere, to the extent that a provision in a regulation was not reasonably justifiable, it is not constitutional. And anybody charged for breach of that certainly has recourse to challenge the constitutionality of whatever regulation.
That was before it went to the House.
Yes, no, that is even now. Even after it's gone to the House. Remember, the regulations didn't go to the House. They still haven't. They can still be challenged on the basis that they were not proportional to the threat that was faced. And that argument, the jury will be out on that for a while. I know that even in the UK, there are challenges. One business owner whose business went bust during the lockdown has sued the government for compensation for loss of his business on the basis that the lockdown wasn't proportional to the threat that was then faced. Those kinds of questions will come up, and I'm sure the answers won't be easy. But I think in all mature democracies, those kinds of tests are warranted.
The irony of that situation, though, is that while, yes, there may be someone out there who's willing enough to challenge the system based on what has happened, as the PM has said, you can't force a man who doesn't have money to pay you what you believe is owed to you, right? So if the
Yes.
government itself is at this point broke, then challenging the legality of what may have led to your business going belly up doesn't necessarily mean that the courts will enforce or will force government to have to pay you any form of compensation.
Well, it can mean that, but as you know, those kinds of challenges take a long time too, and they take resources to pursue to the highest levels for proper resolution. So that it does require a certain commitment and discipline in order to pursue those types of challenges. And it's for that reason, largely, that you probably won't see a lot of it. But if it's somebody's entire economic existence that's under threat or that has been lost, you might well see that kind of effort coming forward because they really have nothing to lose in any event. They've already lost it. I think, though, that those questions should loom and society should consider them because following blindly any authoritarian or other regime never leads to a good place. We need to be critical, we need to think for ourselves, and we need to assess risk for ourselves. That's the basis of our constitutional democracy. And we shouldn't relinquish it very easily.
Let's continue with this conversation of law enforcement within the context of the national response. As Marlene mentioned earlier, a great deal of power and discretion was conferred on the department as a result of the existing state of affairs. There are some instances where persons allege police brutality. There are some instances where there are clear abuse of power. One can't help but think of the video of the officers recording the man and the woman in an encounter. My question is, on the other hand, one can argue, well, the state of emergency has seen or has allowed for a considerable decrease in violent crimes. Is that also safe to say? Because when you look at the month of April, for instance, the murder rate has been down considerably.
Yeah.
One can attribute it to the state of emergency. But do you think that based on everything that has been forthcoming and that has been put forward during these times, that, for instance, this is one positive result of it? Or do you believe that perhaps discretion is yet to be exercised in certain other areas where we're seeing a number of arrests that ultimately are questionable?
Yes. The way the system works is that the police gets to exercise that authority first, and you get to question it later when it's time to reach court. Now, that means you may have to suffer some abuse between the time the event occurs and you reaching court. That's always been the case, even in the absence of a state of emergency. That's just where the system works. Let me answer your question by reference. I'll paint a scenario for you. If Belize had a prison with 450,000 cells, if it did, and it sterilized that prison, and it took all of us, one by one, tested us, and made sure we were free of the virus, and then proceeded to put us in that cell, and feed us, clothe us, control our movements entirely, and lock us down until the virus has gone away. That would be a perfect solution in terms of no infections and in terms of absolutely no crime during the period. But it's ridiculous to suggest it as a way of managing that kind of crisis in our system. And that's because it's excessive. It ignores the rights of others, rights that we consider to be fundamental to every human being. So that in the management of any crisis, what you're dealing with is trying to find a balance between the curtailment of those rights only to the extent necessary to confront and address the risk, but preserving them otherwise. And where you are with regard to the side effect of the lockdown on crime, and you have to remember that there was preventative detention even before. There was some state of emergency declared in certain neighborhoods, and a lot of gang members were locked up. The trouble with that approach is that it may well be too heavy-handed, and it may be that the rights of persons are being infringed in achieving that result. And we don't want to achieve results in that fashion.
Fair enough.
So, you're putting forward your position at this time, and, we're expecting that today the Oversight Committee is going to meet, that the Cabinet will perhaps discuss whatever recommendations come out of that committee tomorrow, and we'll probably see new adjustments made by midweek.
Yes.
And that's provided that there's no confirmed case that takes place between now and then. You are also a part of the Bar Association. Have you taken up this position with the others from the association and maybe put forward this position, volunteer your time maybe even to help in drafting the legislation? So something along those lines, so you don't just say that it should be done, but do something, go the extra mile.
No, these are things I've said before in other fora.
Yeah.
But, and certainly that will come. There was a danger in criticizing too early, because we do want to give the authorities an opportunity to deal with it. It's in everybody's interest that it be dealt with. So there's been a balancing up in terms of not wanting to be too critical in a critical period of time.
Yeah.
But I think we're reaching a moment where there is a moment of calm, where we can reflect and chart a way forward in a more rational way, and not in a panicked way, in a rational, scientific way.
Yeah.
And I think there can be criticisms as to what has gone forward. And as you've said, hindsight is indeed 2020. And that is true. We can all criticize after the fact. But what we need to do is to learn from the criticism going forward. And I think we're at a point where we can correct some of these things. And we need to start moving in that direction, because living under COVID requires what everybody calls the new normal. And what we need to do is to define the parameters of that new normal. And we need to do it in the way that we normally do it, through debates in Parliament, a full fleshing of the proposals, and an enactment of them by way of law.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We do hope that this is going to be the time that we see a revision, and most importantly a refinement as to what we do at the very instant that the next case is confirmed.
Yes, and I do want to leave you with this, because this kinds of experience requires more vigilance and scrutiny from the public. If it is, and it's an argument I've posited, if it is that we're transitioning from democracy to some sort of authoritarian regime, then the next signal that comes is an attempt to postpone elections on the basis of emergency. And we need to be very wary of that.
You throw another conversation in just at the very end. We know that November is actually the deadline, but am I made to understand that within the law there is a window of time where it can be delayed?
Yes, there is. But I'm talking about extending states of emergency right through all of those periods and not observing any of those time limits.
All right. Well, that will definitely be a conversation we can follow up on. We do appreciate you sharing your perspective this morning.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
And there you have it. That was our COVID-19 update for today. You know, he said something so important in the end, that it is now a time, since I think a lot of the fear has been alleviated, that we can look critically and honestly at what our response has been like so far. And I know that there are people whose feathers will be ruffled instantaneously at perhaps offering criticisms, but it is important, We figured our way through that first outbreak as it went along, and everybody, for the most part, adhered to the regulations, but it doesn't mean that it's not time to take stock and do it better the next time around. So we want to thank Andrew for adding that perspective this morning. What we're going to do now is go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking to the Student Union of Belize. That's coming up in a few. Stay tuned.
This COVID update was brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price, but stay for the service.
Children can keep learning at home in
at risk of becoming seriously ill from the flu or the coronavirus. People over the age of 60, persons with medical conditions they already had, such as diabetes or heart disease or conditions that has made their immune system low, such as HIV or cancers. At this time, there is no vaccine or treatment. Serious cases may need oxygen or ventilator support. Be caring and show support for your elderly loved one during this time. A health and wellness message from your Ministry of Health.
And we're back. And before we have our chit chat with the Student Union for this morning, we're actually going to shift things around and move into kids time. So parents, that means get the kids in front of the television. It's time for a little bit of edutainment with Dr. Binox. And of course, Kids Time is brought to you by J&W Shopping Mart. And today, Dr. Binox is going to be teaching us about famous inventions. And specifically, the kids love this one, parents not so much. We're going to find out about Play-Doh. So please, let's check it out.